Earth 2150, not to be confused with Warzone 2100, was released smack dab in the year 2000. This was a time of great innovation in the real-time strategy game space, with many companies across the globe creating unique spins on the genre. Earth 2150 specifically came from Polish developer Reality Pump, located in Bielsko-Biała.
Well, actually, you forgot Poland.
Earth 2150 wasn't their first rodeo, with them having created Earth 2140 in the late 90s, but that game was just a dress rehearsal for what was to come. Earth 2150 is a remarkably feature-rich real-time strategy game, even by modern standards. As is quickly becoming a refrain for the games I cover on this channel, what it does best, nobody has come close since. But let's take a step back here. I want to introduce you to the game on its own terms. To start, the game's intro video goes hard. Absurdly hard. If there's any property that earns the honor of a title drop that explodes both on and off the screen, it's this one. But the cutscenes don't stop after the intro. You're immediately presented with recruitment videos for each of the game's 3 factions. The factions themselves evoking the 3 most common kinds of people on Twitter: bots, tankies, and moon women. Or, more literally, the United Civilized States, the Eurasian Dynasty, and the Lunar Corporation. Their recruitment videos are masterful world building. The aim of each of these factions is about the same: get the hell off of Earth. Following a massive nuclear exchange after a failed United Civilized States invasion of Eurasian Dynasty-controlled Britain, Earth was knocked out of its orbits. Allegedly, this isn't actually scientifically possible, but set that aside. Needless to say, Earth's days are numbered. And I mean that literally. A helpful counter at the top of the screen when you're at your main base ticks down to Earth's destruction. This is the essence of Earth 2150's campaign. It asks you to balance collecting resources for your unit's structures and research with collecting resources for your faction's evacuation project before the Earth goes kablooey. This is a pretty unique long-term trade-off to manage, though admittedly it's very, very hard to actually hit this time limit. The limit still serves a purpose, however, instilling a nice sense of urgency. But let me drill down on something important here. When I say main base, I mean your main base for the entire campaign. Even while you're engaging in a mission, you can research and build units that you can send back and forth via a transport. It is this focus on persistence that is Earth 2150's most notable feature, with the cumulative effect being that the campaign feels like a prolonged war, rather than a set of unconnected incidental battles. Research is persistent too, and honestly, I can't tell you how happy it makes me to just not have to go through the motions of researching the same upgrades over and over. Anyway, from your faction's main base, you select missions to go on a delightful 3D globe interface. Notably, as the campaign progresses, the world itself becomes more and more broken and desolate, a striking visual flourish. The missions have a variety of objectives, but the majority of them boil down to crushing enemy forces and collecting resources for your faction's escape project. The mission maps of Earth 2150 themselves are interesting. First and foremost, I have to compliment the game's terrain system, which is pretty incredible for 2000. Not only do you have multi-layered cliffs and valleys, you have the ability to build bridges across bodies of water, and even tunnel networks underneath the map itself. Of all these systems, elevation tends to come into play the most, as weapons fire generally requires line of sight to strike a target. Now, while I appreciate all these systems and how much time and effort they likely took to implement, I kind of wish the maps themselves were a bit more distinct. Specifically, the approach the developers took to creating the maps seems to have been to recreate miniature versions of major landmasses. For example, this is Madagascar, this is Japan, and this is the Great Lakes. I'd be curious if they used existing public topological data to help generate these, or if they spent the time to sculpt them manually with the robust map editor that comes with the game. Regardless of how they created the maps, the vast majority are rather barren without much in the way of doodads. Give me the doodads. There's no evidence that humans ever lived in most of these maps, with only a handful even having ruins. It's map making at its most literal, pure topography. This, admittedly, can likely be chalked up to the time the game was released in, but it's still a bit underwhelming. Another issue is that it can often be rather unclear where you should or even can go, requiring quite a considerable amount of aerial scouting to even find the enemy in some maps. But while the game might not have the best maps, it might just have the best units. You see, units in URF 2150 are highly modular. You can mix and match various weapons and chassis, with late-game chassis even having multiple weapon hardpoints. You can save as many templates as you want, and upgrade the templates as needed. This modularity extends to buildings as well. You can customize what weapon systems each and every defensive structure has. Even some production structures have weapon slots to play with. This might sound like a lot of fiddling, but it's pretty seamless in practice. Another special feature in URF 2150 is that units using projectile ammunition actually require occasional resupply from vehicles launched from aerial supply depots. This means you actually have to keep your resupply corridor airspace in mind when your army is in the field. It's not a huge thing, but it adds an interesting twist to keeping the rockets flying. And fly the rockets do, at a tremendous range for the heavy rocket variants. This is, admittedly, my go-to tactic for the game, tearing into an enemy base from beyond the range of its defensive structures, gradually working my way in with units holding position, destroying anything that dares approach. While your units generally have a good bit of survivability, they can still melt under sustained fire. Compounding the pain of losing units, unit production times are very high, particularly for the more complex endgame units, so it pays to be precise. But this is where the game's focus on persistence once again shines, as you can and indeed should take your army back to your main base at the end of each mission, and send them into the next mission map as quickly as you can after starting. This can take some time, as the transport only lets you take 10 units a trip, and it takes a minute to fly to and from the mission area. But I'm not gonna complain, as these limitations seem quite important to balancing the experience. The game smartly forces you to use this mechanic early on to make sure you understand it. For example, in the early United Civilized States mission Alaska, you start with nothing but a landing zone, requiring you to bring in a construction unit or troops to handle the enemy forces. If you bring the proper units, air units in this case, you can destroy the attackers without taking a single hit of damage, as the enemy tanks can't attack flying units. Now, given the campaign goal, it probably wouldn't surprise you that a big part of most missions is scrambling for resources. Namely, you want to destroy your enemies before they can mine out their resources, both to complete your evacuation project quicker and to keep researching and reinforcing your army. Adding another layer to the importance of resources, unlike most RTS games of the time, I'm pretty sure the AI isn't actually getting cheat resources. At least not on the same level it usually does in the genre. You can generally tell when your AI opponents are flat broke, as they'll stop sending units and not be able to construct anything. But again, you absolutely do not want to wait for that. You want to grab everything you can. And this harvesting looks different for each faction. The United Civilized States follows a very Command and Conquer style harvester and refinery system. The Lunar Corporation plops down structures that passively mine and refine. The Eurasian Dynasty, perhaps as a subtle commentary on Soviet-style bureaucracy, requires you to build both a mine structure, a refinery structure, and have a transport unit that does nothing but transfers ore pellets from the mine to the refinery. If you position the buildings correctly, all the transport needs to do is rotate, the moral equivalent of an inserter arm from Factorio. You can see how URF 2150's developers put in quite a lot of work to make interestingly asymmetric factions. Fittingly, each campaign plays quite differently too. I would argue the United Civilized States campaign is the best to start with. It begins simply enough, fighting off Eurasian Dynasty forces and securing modest sums of resources. The big challenge when fighting ED forces being their laser weaponry, which ignores hit points, cooking a unit in seconds. As they pack quite a few laser turrets on their buildings, one must advance carefully, at least until you get shield technology later on in the campaign. You get shields from the Lunar Corporation, whether by force or as a reward for working with them. It's surprisingly flexible that you can make the choice to ally with them or not, as it changes the campaign significantly for more than a few missions. The largest downside of working with them being their continual theft of your resource patches, if you don't keep an eye on them. Thankfully, you can destroy their mines with no consequences by manually attacking them as they drop in. This alliance unravels later on in the campaign when the Eurasian Dynasty's elite hacker, Neo, hacks your units and attacks a nearby Lunar Corporation base with them, causing the LC to cancel your treaty. Perhaps the only time in recorded history somebody was actually unjustly cancelled after being hacked. Neo is a real piece of work. Aside from being a vaguely racist nerd, he pulls out the trick of converting every UCS unit other than the transport on the map to his control. He does this quite a few times throughout the campaign. This happens at fixed times or triggers in each mission, making the optimal play to save scum and load your troops onto the transport or otherwise get them out of the picture. Eventually, though, you finally take him down, at least until he crops up in the expansions. Neo's shenanigans aside, once you get a good death ball of plasma-slinging mechs together, you can pretty much face roll most missions, and quickly secure enough resources to win the campaign. In true classic Americana fashion, the lucky UCS evacuees escape the ravages of Earth in a massive 1950s flying saucer. Pretty sweet. But let's move on to the Lunar Corporation's campaign. The LC play quite different from the other factions. And not just the aforementioned resourcing differences either. For one thing, the LC have no construction vehicles. They drop their buildings from space. I believe the Codex Astartes names this maneuver Steel Rain. Of course, this is incredibly useful, but the buildings are vulnerable before they land. Another difference is that unlike the other factions, the LC's energy network is global, requiring no transmission buildings. And as the faction of the future, their grid is solar-powered.
Solar power.
Requiring you to store energy in batteries for use during the night. The LC's units are all hover vehicles, piloted by chipper women.
I'm moving out!
Except for one very special exception. You see, the LC campaign actually has a hero unit, your commander and point of view character, a UCS war hero foreign exchange student dude sent to help the LC, Fang. This goes about the places you would expect a game released in this time period to go with the gender dynamics. Though I will say, it's a bit more tactful than you might be imagining most of the time. It's kind of funny the way the Moon Women aren't sure what to make of him, with the faction leader having to sometimes interject and reassign people for violating space HR policy and all. Overall, the LC campaign has a lot more personality than the UCS campaign, which, the UCS being a faction dominated by robots, makes perfect sense. There's a lot more characters communicating with you in various missions, and most of them sign their emails Health and Happiness, which I always found charming. So as you would expect, you work with the UCS from the beginning. Similar to the UCS campaign, you have to prevent your allies from stealing your resources. Here you need to put up laser fencing to corral your allies' harvesters, preventing them from getting in or out of your fields. Still a bit silly, but fun in its own way. But this partnership doesn't last, and they unceremoniously end their alliance with you by email, mid-mission while fighting a mutual Eurasian Dynasty enemy. Not exactly a top 10 anime betrayal. On that note, the LC campaign kinda falls apart towards the end. Plot emails stop having senders, and you can generally tell they were cutting corners. The campaign itself is a short one, requiring only half the resources to complete compared to the other factions' evacuation projects. From a world-building perspective, this does make sense as the LC clearly have more space infrastructure than the other factions, but still, come on now. You barely get a chance to use your endgame tech before the campaign is over. The Electrobolts are fun, at least. Finally, the Eurasian Dynasty campaign. Oh dear god, the Eurasian Dynasty campaign. It's the first campaign on the main menu, so I would almost call it a beginner's trap. The ED units feel significantly flimsier than the other factions, though you do start with the very useful 105mm cannons unlocked, as well as their laser weapons relatively early. That said, the campaign significantly turns up the difficulty midway through, having you face off against 4 different AI opponents working together against you in some maps. It's an absolute meat grinder, not helped by your unit cap feeling painfully low. The ED campaign is also where you have to engage with the game's terraforming and tunneling mechanics the most. While engaging with those systems is ultimately a good thing, it piles on the pressure when you're trying to defeat your enemies and claim their resources as quickly as possible. Given these terrain challenges, you rapidly come to appreciate the ED's powerful helicopters, raining death from above. Frustratingly though, these helicopters have a very unfortunate issue when transporting them between maps. Their blades have to completely stop before they are loaded into the transport. This, needless to say, presents quite the hindrance. Still, you kind of have to use them, just probably a good idea to load and send your ground troops first. There is one bright spot though in the campaign. You can literally raid Area 51. Although bright spot may be a bit of an overstatement because the map is pure tunnels. Endless tunnels. I can kinda see what the map designer was going for, but this is just exhausting. Arbitrary labyrinths are a drag in most games, and here it's especially dire. It forces you to confront enemies point blank in narrow tunnels, with your troops not quite making the most of their laser weaponry without micromanagement, and your tunnel entrance under constant air assault. At the end of it though, you do indeed get your UFO on. And while it's not quite the most OP UFO in gaming, it is pretty sweet. It absolutely wrecks any enemy structure you point it at. I should quickly shout out the tireless non-combat vehicles of the Eurasian dynasty, perpetually breaking something.
Okay. Uh-oh.
One of my favorite barks of any RTS unit ever, even if I can't quite understand what they're saying sometimes.
Action at last.
Over the course of the campaign, your point of view commander character is rewarded for their deeds with various medals, and even improved living quarters, Papers, Please style. Amusingly, this is somewhat at odds with the framing of the campaign, as your point of view commander is a nepo baby of the Tsar, Vladimir II. Regardless, a campaign worth conquering to be sure. Just don't feel bad if you have to crank down the difficulty now and again. The difficulty settings are on a per mission basis for a reason. So we've been looking at the game for a while now, but I gotta comment on the visuals here real quick.
You look Polish.
Or maybe it's, look, Polish!
While the graphics are somewhat aged, to put it mildly, they were groundbreaking for the time. Such a graphical powerhouse, it took me quite a while until I even had a computer capable of running the game properly. Though, amusingly, I had access to a computer that ran the game at a blazing fast half a frame per second or so. Even this blew my socks off, seeing a full 3D RTS for the first time. I watched glacially slow construction animations in the tutorial missions in amazement. Though, as you might expect, I didn't advance particularly far past that, until I had a computer with an actual graphics card. And when I finally got that GeForce 4 equipped rig, I was certainly not disappointed. I wish I could say the same for the other GPU-requiring Polish strategy game I had been waiting to play, Project Earth Starmageddon, which I had somehow picked up at a Walmart in Stanton, Virginia while visiting my grandmother, but that's a story for another day. Anyway, Earth 2150's 3D model work is great. They also implemented a supremely impressive day-night cycle complete with an elaborate lighting system. Textures are a bit washed, but come on now. This dropped pre-9/11. This is a graphical miracle for the time, and honestly, I think it holds up surprisingly well. They even use the spinning model menu design that I'm starting to think might be a staple of European strategy games of the time. I'll add that the interface itself is quite clean and usable as well. Now, aside from the fully 3D gameplay, the game sports a hefty 58 pre-rendered cutscenes, mostly news reports. These aren't just shown in between missions like you might expect in other strategy games. These reports pop up in a video player interface over the course of your missions, often giving you updates on the environmental devastation of Earth, the research projects you complete, and your overall progress on the evacuation. Real-time strategy game old heads might remember Act of War Direct Action as the earliest game that cleanly meshed mid-mission cutscenes with RTS gameplay, but I would argue Earth 2150 walked so that game could run. These news cutscenes are a wonderful bit of world building and really help to sell the scope of the campaigns. Earth 2150's music is, scientifically speaking, fucking sick. Even from the campaign selection screen, each faction has their own distinct flair, though my favorite has to be the Lunar Corporation's dark, moody synths. The UCS soundtrack, as one would expect from a successor state of America, is full of kick-ass electric guitar riffs. The Eurasian Dynasty tracks have a militaristic march vibe about them, which feels in line with their theming. In general, the music in the game is quite dynamic. There are tracks that play in the daytime, tracks that play at night, and tracks that play during combat. The combat music in particular goes pretty hard. An interesting element of the soundtrack is that its songs often use parts of famous public domain pieces. For example, in Lunar Corporation War II, you might recognize parts of a song from Pictures at an Exhibition. Or, if you're an intellectual, that one episode of South Park where they said shit a lot. Admittedly, over the course of each 10-hour or so campaign, the music can get a bit repetitive. Would be nice if there was just a bit more variety, as the dynamically used songs are a little on the short side, but all the same, definitely a strong showing for the time, often elevating the personality and feel of each of the factions quite a bit. Something else that boosts the soundscape of the game is how units' audio barks change as they take damage, becoming more distant and fuzzy.
Mech ready to go. Mech ready.
It's a small thing, but it's a good reminder to repair your units, and makes the damage seem like more than just a few pips on a health bar. When I bought the soundtrack for the game on Steam, I was surprised to find a song that I'm pretty sure doesn't occur anywhere in the actual game. Specifically, Earth Techno. It even comes with an AMV-like video which sets the songs to clips from the game's cutscenes, using some of the cutscene audio too. While I generally prefer house to techno, this feels deeply nostalgic to me somehow, really hitting that sweet spot of a moment in the evolution of both game development and EDM. So while I love the game, I'm gonna have to admit that there's some significant issues with it. Some things are minor issues, like the mini-map being a bit illegible at times, or the building category tabs containing a very unfortunate abbreviation. There's also larger issues with the terraforming system being a bit wonky, sometimes trapping units. Or, like how I can't build a bridge across this river to an already existing partially destroyed bridge for some reason. Sometimes mission objectives can be rather unclear, with no objective markers on the map. Some of the biggest issues with the game are the technical ones, which is admittedly about what you'd expect from a game that's a quarter century old. The game comes with a setup utility, allowing you to pick from a variety of renderers and resolutions, but what they don't tell you is that you don't want to try to run the game at 4K, or even at a 16:9 resolution, as that seems to break quite a few things, like cutscenes not playing correctly. Thankfully, there are fan patches available for the game and all its expansions to fix the more egregious issues. The people who create these patches are the real unsung heroes of retro PC gaming. While Earth 2150 primarily tells its story through emails and videos, it's also on the tail end of the generation of games that sometimes loaded up their game manuals with lore details not present in the game itself. The manual goes into the deeper histories of each of the three factions. For the Eurasian Dynasty, a sizable section is the diary of one of the founders of the faction, a Russian soldier named
Sergei.
It opens in the War of 2048, a devastating, sometimes nuclear war that led to the collapse of all European and Asian governments. Emerging from his fallout shelter, and his followers made their way to the Mongolian steppes, where they assisted a nomadic tribe called the Khans in defeating their competing neighbors, eventually merging into the tribe itself. This is why you will sometimes hear ED units say, "Glory to the Khan." From there, the dynasty expanded rapidly and eventually came into conflict with the United Civilized States. Speaking of, I really have to praise the United Civilized States lore here. It starts out more or less in the present until a massive economic collapse occurs. As irrational exuberance gave way to incurable pessimism, one international corporation after another simply dissolved. Factories closed their doors, and pictures of millions of unemployed wandering around desolate city centers in the vain hope of finding something to eat came to symbolize the plight of the 21st century. Honestly, fire, and probably soon to be terrifyingly true to life, but this is just the beginning. To focus attention away from the miserable economic situation, those in power pushed for a guns instead of butter policy. Defense outlays were dramatically increased, and siege mentality created among the population. For 30 long years, Americans were made to believe the entire world had become an enemy, and that foreign armies were just waiting for the right moment to attack. Guys, serious question, are we on the Earth 2150 timeline? Because reading this, I feel like we're on the Earth 2150 timeline. Anyway, the War of 2048 begins, and the United States, like all the other nations, is ravaged by nuclear war. Though sizable portions of it are spared because of a top-rate missile defense system. It's hard to imagine a world where modern Star Wars doesn't disappoint people, but I suppose it could happen. Anyhow, after the nukes fell, the lore says that 12 former US states emerged from the rubble to form the beginnings of the United Civilized States. Now, the question quickly becomes, which 12 states were they? The lore does not spell it out directly, and it would be pretty funny to imagine some of these combinations. Realistically, though, it was probably a few of the most populous states and their neighbors. For sure California, given that Stanford continues to exist as a research hub throughout the game. As the UCS began rebuilding, they radically changed their system of government. Having seen firsthand the consequences of extreme political corruption, they chose to start selecting people at random from the population to serve as political leadership, with each posting only lasting a few months. This is apparently called a stokocracy. Doing a little searching, it turns out this term was coined by a French writer, Roger de Sisyphe, in 1998 in his book La Stokocracy. I guess the Disco Elysium writers were not the only game writers to read theory. These greenhorn politicians could rely on highly specialized computer systems to assist them in day-to-day matters of state. In fact, they had begun depending so much upon these so-called advisors that after a while, it became clear these systems were fully capable of running the government without their human overseers. Not to put too fine a point on it, but given the time period involved, it's hard not to imagine the UCS run by a generation of iPad kids with ChatGPT. Soon thereafter, using alien technology uncovered in Area 51, they built robots to do all of society's work, making the residents of the UCS quite comfortable, particularly relative to those still picking up the pieces in other parts of the world. This peace and prosperity was violently interrupted when a new defense minister began feeding the defense system, Golan, bad data, causing it to invade the Eurasian dynasty-controlled British Isles. Quite the consequence of a large language model hallucination, really. This all leads to the events of Earth 2140, the first game in the series. It is in the final act of this war that the Eurasian dynasty fatefully launched the nuclear strike in the Arctic that knocked the Earth off its orbit. Finally, the Lunar Corporation. Arguably the most fleshed out faction in terms of personality in the game itself, though you may find yourself wondering in what ways this monastic order is or ever was a corporation. Strangely, the lore doesn't go into detail there, but we do find out some other interesting history. The Lunar Corporation was originally a SpaceX-like company that in 2012 completely took over from NASA. Thankfully, this hasn't quite happened yet in real life, so maybe we're not on the Earth 2150 timeline after all. Anyway, after making a bunch of money off of space tourism, they began construction on their moon base, creatively named Luna. This project became the focus of their efforts as the threat of nuclear war ramped up in the 2040s. When war finally broke out in 2048, the LC cut off communication with Earth completely and focused on building a new society on the moon. However, this quickly ran into issues. All was not rosy. Cracks in the facade appeared as time went by. The majority of the inhabitants were extremely wealthy people who had led very comfortable lives on Earth. Now, forced to live in rough, primitive conditions and do hard physical labor, they started grumbling, loudly. About what one would expect from a Galt's Gulch situation, really. The citizens revolted. The aging president was removed from power. His declining health had long ago turned him into little more than a figurehead. It was clearly impossible for him to take full control of the situation. The rebellion was suppressed in a sea of blood, and its ringleaders killed by simply pushing them through an airlock without spacesuits. Despite the failure of this revolt, a new check was instituted for the benefit of the people, an elected judge who could remove members of the government who acted against society's interest. Following this, the ideology of the corporation shifted quite radically. A new order had finally arrived, and with it, a new philosophy was starting to take root. The maxim was, a man's worth as an individual is based on the benefit he brings to society. A citizen's status was defined by his knowledge, skills, and diligence, and how he put those to work. An interesting ideological intersection of collectivism and meritocracy. Not quite the fully automated luxury experience of the UCS, but not the worst way to organize a society either. From there, the Lunar Corporation hit the books hard. Investing tremendously in research and development, they found a crashed alien spaceship and reverse-engineered its anti-grav technology, which is how the LC got the technology for their hover vehicles. In true SpaceX fashion, they even set their sights on terraforming Mars, apparently considerably more realistic in this universe than our own. The War of 2148 knocking Earth off its orbit, adding new time pressure to this project, to say the least. So yeah, admittedly not a whole lot in there about how it became a Moon Witch coven, or why they never dropped the corporation from their faction name. Perhaps the manual blurb was written before the faction's theming fully came together. Anyhow, I love all the world building in this lore, and I realize most of it takes place decades or even a century before the game itself, but I do wish we could have seen more of this in the actual game itself. Regardless, in terms of strategy game manual lore, I resoundingly give this an A+. Earth 2150 has two expansions. First, the Moon Project. It has some marked deviations from the original's formula, namely the focus no longer being on raising the money for your evacuation project, freeing you up to be able to sell your buildings, recycle your units, and focus more on the campaign missions themselves. It's a nice twist on the gameplay, though it still has a few rough edges now and again. The intro for it is quite striking.
Welcome to Earth in the year 2150. Witness the death throes of a once mighty planet, ravaged by endless war and mindless destruction.
Now, the other expansion, Earth 2150 Lost Souls, I hadn't actually played before researching for this video. Unfortunately, it did not leave a great first impression. The very first mission throws you into a map where you're unable to build a base or call in any support, stuck with an army of units with limited ammo, required to attack and destroy a fairly significant enemy base. On the positive side, I can see they're trying to add more varied gameplay to the formula, bringing in this classic Command & Conquer 1 style mission while retaining much of the storytelling style of the other campaigns. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work for me here, as with no way to resupply your units other than a few ammo artifacts, you have to excessively micromanage to not waste ammo, which, after having just played through the entirety of 2150, I'm not down for right now, to put it mildly. Still, if enough people recommend it, I might give it another shake. But what I really want to talk about is Earth 2150's sequel, Earth 2160. A game I fondly remember as a disaster in a lot of amusing ways. Upon purchasing it on Steam, the game clearly sensed my intent and made it all but impossible to type in my CD key to activate the weird third-party DRM and actually play it. This appears to be caused by some kind of weird Windows 11 related issue where the keyboard input is only sporadically recognized. This made typing in the CD key an arduous affair, mashing the next few letters in the sequence and deleting as needed. This feels like a karmic punishment specifically for me, as Earth 2160 was one of the first games I acquired in a less than on the up and up manner as a kid. Of course, after having gone through this mess, I then realized I should probably check the Steam forums, and lo and behold, somebody posted a patched exec file fixing the issue. Oops. That aside, the technical issues don't stop here. The game doesn't play the English version of the intro when it's first started,
Zeit vor dem Untergang der Erde. Dann ziehen die Bilder an meinem inneren Auge vorbei, wie ein Film aus vergangenen Tagen.
An English version of the intro is not even included in the game's files, so I guess they just straight up picked the wrong file when putting their deployment together. Once you get past this intro and actually start playing the game, though, that's when the interesting choices of Earth 2160 rapidly become apparent. Many correctly argue that Homeworld 3 was let down by its overly personal style of storytelling, but let me be the first to tell you, the gulf between Homeworld 2 and 3 has nothing on the gulf between Earth 2150 and 60.
Bells, buy one.
Meet Michael Faulkner, somehow the protagonist of each of the game's 4 campaigns. Notably, I only played the first mission of the first campaign for this video, but oh dear god did the memories come rushing back. The ham story, the goofy voice acting, the strange base building, the wonky combat, it all came back to me. The experience reached its apex when the first mission's end cutscene revealed itself to be a texture wall placed on the actual map. The game dev artifice of old, no match for a modern resolution. I am begging you, yes you, watching this, if you want my next video to be me tearing Earth 2160 a new asshole, please comment below so I know there's interest. Making this video on Earth 2150, one of my childhood favorites, was fun and all, but in hindsight, all of this might just wind up being the preamble to the abject mastery on display in Earth 2160. And at this point, I would be perfectly okay with that. Far from being Eurojank from before the term was even coined, Earth 2150 remains one of the most feature-rich real-time strategy games ever made, successfully accomplishing much of its intended design. It is an indictment of the RTS genre that we haven't seen anything quite like it since. Though the golden age of RTS games is firmly behind us, one would think that somebody would have stepped up to the plate by now. I suppose this may speak to the extreme challenge of designing and balancing real-time strategy games, particularly ones that break convention so wildly. And while Earth 2150 may have lacked the polish, of what few quality modern real-time strategy games are still commonly played, the game serves as a reminder of what's possible. A promise that if we're lucky, may be fulfilled someday. And, more than anything, proves that Poland can, in fact, into space.